The contract sat on the mahogany desk between them, 3 pages of dense academic language that made Professor Elena Vasquez's head pound harder than the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her university office. $15,000. That's what the contract said her tutoring services were worth for the remainder of the semester. 3 months of her life. Every rule written in precise legal terminology. Every boundary outlined in clinical detail. Every clause designed to ensure her complete compliance with the academic success of one student. And at the bottom of the last page, in handwriting she recognized as her own, messy, slightly tilted, the way she wrote when she'd had too much wine, sat her signature. She didn't remember signing it. She didn't remember how she'd ended up passed out on the leather couch in her office, wrapped in a cashmere throw that definitely wasn't hers, wearing a silk blouse that cost more than her monthly rent. She didn't remember the aspirin and water sitting on her desk, placed there like someone had anticipated the hangover before she'd even opened her eyes. But what she remembered least of all was the student now standing in her doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee, wearing a smile that looked less like a greeting and more like the first move in a chess game she'd been playing for weeks without Elena's knowledge. Her name was Sloane Hart, and before this story was over, you were going to hate her. Then you were going to understand her. And then you were going to wish you hadn't. Let me tell you who these 2 women are, because you need to understand what's at stake before everything falls apart. Elena Vasquez was 34 years old, a tenured professor of art history at one of the most prestigious universities on the East Coast. She had spent the last 6 years building a reputation as the kind of professor students either worshipped or feared, sometimes both. Her lectures were legendary, her standards impossibly high, and her office hours were perpetually booked by students desperate to earn her approval. She had dark brown hair she usually wore in a sleek low ponytail, fingers perpetually stained with charcoal from her own sketching, and a sharp tongue that could cut through the most carefully constructed excuse in under 10 seconds. Her students called her La Professora behind her back, half in reverence, half in terror. She was talented in the kind of way that made people stop and stare at her work when she displayed it, even when they didn't know her name. Her scholarship on Renaissance iconography had been cited in 3 major journals. Her own arty, dark, emotional, obsessed with the relationship between light and shadow, had been shown in 2 small galleries that she never spoke about because speaking about it made it real, and making it real meant risking failure. She had been married once, to a woman who'd left her 3 years ago for a lawyer with a beach house and a less demanding schedule. The divorce had been civil. The aftermath had been anything but. Elena had poured herself into her work, building walls around her heart so thick that even she couldn't see over them anymore. Then there was Sloane. Sloane Hart was 22, a senior art history major with a trust fund that could buy most small countries and a grade point average that had been teetering dangerously close to academic probation for the better part of a year. She was tall, with sharp features and dark blonde hair she wore in perfect waves that fell past her shoulders. She had a way of looking at people that made them feel like she'd already read every page of their story before they'd even opened their mouths, and found most of it boring. She was beautiful in the kind of way that made people uncomfortable. Not because she was intimidating, though she was that too, but because she moved through the world like she expected it to accommodate her. She wore tailored blazers and designer shoes to class, sat in the front row, and had never once taken a note that she actually reviewed later. But here was what the university didn't know about Sloane Hart. Behind the designer clothes and the careless confidence, she hadn't slept through the night in 2 years. She had panic attacks that she managed with medication and meditation and sheer force of will. She had a mother who called her every Sunday to remind her that she was the family's last hope, the one who was supposed to do something important, something that would make all those private school tuitions and summer internships worth it. And she had a transcript that looked like a battlefield. In her first 2 years, She'd been brilliant, top of her class, dean's list, the kind of student professors fought over for their research projects. Then everything had fallen apart. A breakdown. A semester off. A slow, grinding return to academic life that felt less like recovery and more like drowning in slow motion. She needed Elena Vasquez's recommendation letter. She needed it more than she'd ever needed anything. Every graduate program she wanted to apply to required a letter from a tenured professor in her field. Every program she wanted required a GPA above 3.5. Every single one required the kind of academic record she'd spent the last 2 years watching slip through her fingers like water. She had 1 semester left to fix it. 1 semester to prove she wasn't the disaster her transcript suggested. 1 semester to convince Elena Vasquez, the hardest professor in the department, the one who gave out A- like they were personal favors, the one who had called Sloane's analysis of Caravaggio's chiaroscuro competent but uninspired in front of the entire class, that she was worth believing in. And so she'd done something that, even now, she wasn't entirely sure she could justify. She'd made a deal. 2 weeks earlier, Sloane had shown up at Elena's office hours with a proposal that had made the professor's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rise halfway to her hairline. $15,000, Sloane said, sliding a check across the desk. 4 private tutoring sessions. Twice a week. 3 hours each. You help me bring my GPA up to a 3.6 by the end of the semester, and I'll also donate $20,000 to the art history department's scholarship fund. Your name on the donation. Your legacy cemented. Elena had stared at the check. Then at Sloane. Then back at the check. Miss Hart, she'd said slowly, I don't think you understand how academic integrity works. I understand perfectly, Sloane had replied, her voice steady even though her hands were shaking slightly beneath the desk. This isn't bribery. This is a tutoring arrangement. You've done private tutoring before. I checked. It's allowed, as long as it doesn't affect grading fairness. Which it would. It doesn't have to. You don't grade my work. You just help me understand the material better. The grades would still be based on my submissions. My work. My effort. She'd leaned forward, her green eyes sharp and focused. I don't want you to give me grades I don't deserve. I want to deserve them. I just need someone who actually knows how to help me get there. Elena had been silent for a long moment. Your GPA is a 2.9, Miss Hart. You need a 3.6. That's a massive jump in 1 semester. I know. Your first 2 years were excellent, but your last 2. I know what my transcript looks like, Professor. Then you know this isn't realistic. I know it's not guaranteed, Sloane had said quietly. I know I'm asking for a lot. I know I don't deserve your help. But I also know what happens if I don't fix this. She'd paused, and something in her composure had cracked, just slightly. My mother will stop paying for my apartment. She'll pull my funding for grad school applications. She'll make me come home and work in the family business and spend the rest of my life wondering if I could have done something else if I'd just tried harder. She hadn't mentioned the breakdown. She hadn't mentioned the hospital stay, the medications, the months when she couldn't get out of bed, the way her advisor had looked at her when she'd come back with pity in his eyes. She hadn't mentioned any of it because mentioning it made it real, and making it real meant admitting that the person who'd nearly flunked out wasn't just someone who'd had a bad year. It was her. It was all her. Elena had studied her for a long moment. Then she'd reached for the check, torn it in half, and dropped the pieces into the trash. I don't want your money, Miss Hart. Sloane's face had fallen. Professor. I want your commitment. Elena had sat back in her chair, arms crossed over her chest. You show up every session. You do the work. You stop making excuses and start making progress. And when we get to the end of the semester, if you've earned that letter, I'll write it. No money changes hands. You do the work, you get the help. That's the deal. Sloane had blinked. That's it? That's it. And she'd signed something. A simple agreement, typed up by Elena's administrative assistant. Just a formality, really. Just a record that tutoring was happening, nothing untoward. Sloane hadn't drunk anything that night. She'd been sober, clear-headed, grateful. So why couldn't she remember signing the contract that was now sitting on Elena's desk? Why couldn't she remember the details of the arrangement that apparently included specific behavioral clauses and a non-fraternization agreement? Why was she waking up in her professor's office with no memory of how she'd gotten there? Good morning, Professor. Elena looked up from the contract to find Sloane still standing in the doorway, coffee cups in hand, expression carefully neutral. Miss Hart. Elena's voice came out rougher than she'd intended. She cleared her throat. What are you doing here? You texted me last night. Sloane's voice was calm, measured, the voice of someone who'd been expecting exactly this moment. Around 11. You said you needed to discuss the contract. I came over, we talked, and then you fell asleep. I didn't want to wake you. Elena stared at her. I texted you? Sloane pulled out her phone, scrolled to a message, and held it up. Professor Vasquez, can you come to my office tonight? We need to discuss the tutoring contract. Some things need clarification, Sloane Hart, of course. I'm free. What time, Professor Vasquez, 11. Don't be late, Don't be late, Elena repeated flatly. I wrote that. You were tired, I think. Sloane set one of the coffees on the desk. You had a glass of wine. Maybe two. You were very insistent that we talk about the terms of the agreement. Elena's jaw tightened. She didn't remember any of this. She remembered grading papers until late. She remembered deciding to open a bottle of wine because it had been a long week and she deserved one glass. She remembered feeling tired, heavy-eyed, and then nothing. The contract, she said slowly, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. You said we discussed the contract. We did. Sloane sat down in the chair across from her, crossing one long leg over the other. Her posture was perfect, her face impassive. You had some concerns. A few provisions you wanted to tighten. Clarity around the boundaries of the arrangement. Elena's eyes dropped back to the document in front of her. 3 pages. She'd read the first 2, but now she forced herself to read the third. The words swam in front of her eyes, but she forced herself to focus. Clause 7, Non-Fraternization Agreement. The participating parties acknowledge that the nature of their relationship is strictly professional. No romantic or intimate involvement of any kind shall occur during the term of this agreement or the 6 months following its conclusion. Clause 12, Confidentiality. The student shall not discuss the terms of this agreement with any third party, including family members, friends, academic advisors, or university officials. Clause 15, Termination. Should either party violate the terms of this agreement, the affected party is entitled to compensation in the amount of $50,000 to cover damages, including but not limited to reputational harm, emotional distress, and potential academic consequences. Section 4, Subsection A. The student agrees to make herself available for tutoring sessions at the professor's discretion. The student shall not request changes to the scheduling of said sessions without the professor's express written consent. The student agrees to comply with all academic requirements outlined by the professor and to produce work of sufficient quality to justify the continued provision of said tutoring services. Asterisk. Elena's hands were trembling by the time she finished reading. Miss Hart. Professor. You know I wouldn't have agreed to this. You signed it, Sloane said mildly. Under duress. While intoxicated. Allegedly intoxicated. I don't actually know what you consumed before I arrived. For all I know, you could have been perfectly sober and just changed your mind about what sort of arrangement you wanted. Elena stared at her. Something cold was spreading through her chest, something that felt alarmingly like fear. Miss Hart, this contract is coercive. It gives me complete control over your academic schedule, restricts your ability to seek help elsewhere, and imposes a non-fraternization clause that suggests. I'm not blackmailing you, Professor. Sloane's voice was soft, almost gentle. I don't want anything from you that you don't want to give. I just want to make sure we both follow through on our commitments. You help me raise my GPA. I help you maintain appropriate boundaries. Boundaries, Elena repeated. You mean the ones you're currently violating by sitting in my office at 7 in the morning with coffee you definitely didn't buy yourself. Sloane's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. I'm being helpful. You're being manipulative. I'm being strategic. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, green eyes fixed on Elena's face. You don't have to like me, Professor. You just have to give me a chance. I don't want special treatment. I just want someone who actually gives a damn about whether I succeed or not. Someone who doesn't look at my transcript and see the girl who had a breakdown, but the girl who fought her way back. Elena was quiet for a long moment. You had a breakdown? Sloane's expression flickered, the first crack in her composure. Yes. A year and a half ago. I was in the hospital. Not for long, but long enough. She looked away. It's not in my file. My parents had it expunged. The official record says I took a leave of absence for medical reasons, nothing more. I didn't know. Nobody knows. Sloane's voice was barely above a whisper. My friends think I was traveling. My professors think I had a family emergency. My family thinks if we don't talk about it, it didn't happen. She looked back at Elena, and there was something raw in her expression now, something unguarded. I need this, Professor. Not because I want to cheat. Not because I think I'm entitled to your help. Because I want to prove to myself that I can still be the person I was before everything fell apart. I don't know if you understand what that's like. Wanting to go back to being someone you used to be. Elena understood better than she wanted to. She thought about her ex-wife's face the day she'd walked out the door. She thought about the months after, when she'd poured everything into her work because work was the only thing that didn't leave. She thought about the way she'd built her walls so high that even she couldn't see over them anymore. 3 months, she said finally. 3 months of tutoring. No money changes hands. You do the work, I do the teaching. And we pretend this contract doesn't exist. Sloane's face lit up with something that might have been hope. You mean it? I mean you show up when you're supposed to. You bring your work. You take notes. You ask questions. And if I catch you trying to manipulate me again, I'll take this contract directly to the dean and let them sort it out. Sloane's smile faded slightly. I'm not manipulating you. Then what would you call it? I'd call it doing whatever it takes. She held Elena's gaze. Which is the same thing I'd tell any of my students to do if they had a chance to save their future. Elena sat back in her chair, the coffee growing cold in her hand, and wondered how she'd ended up in this situation. 3 weeks ago, Sloane Hart had been just another name on her roster, a talented but troubled student with a transcript that made her wince. Now she was sitting across from her, beautiful and infuriating and desperate in a way Elena recognized because she'd been there herself, once, a long time ago. Fine, she said. We start Monday. 6 p.m. Bring your Caravaggio paper. I don't have a Caravaggio paper. You will by Monday. Sloane's smile returned, wider this time. Yes, Professor. The first week was silent warfare. Not the kind with screaming or thrown objects. Elena didn't do screaming, and Sloane was too controlled for throwing. This was the kind that lived in the spaces between words, in the weight of eye contact held 1 second too long, in the careful withholding of anything that might be mistaken for surrender. Sloane showed up at 6 sharp, perfectly on time, with a laptop and a carafe of coffee from the expensive cafe near campus that she definitely hadn't been carrying when she walked in the door. She set it on Elena's desk without a word, then sat down and opened her computer like it was the most natural thing in the world. Caravaggio, she said, her voice carefully neutral. 10 pages. The assignment calls for an analysis of the chiaroscuro technique and how it functions as a narrative device rather than merely a stylistic choice. Elena blinked. You wrote the paper? I did. She'd been expecting excuses. Requests for extensions. The kind of academic flailing she'd seen from students who'd coasted on their intelligence until they realized intelligence alone wasn't enough. Instead, Sloane pulled up a document and turned the laptop to face her. I'm not going to pretend it's good, Sloane continued, her voice revealing nothing. But I finished it. I wanted to prove I was serious about this arrangement. Elena read the first paragraph. Then the second. By the third, she was leaning forward, her coffee forgotten. It's not bad. High praise from a professor who once described my work as competent but uninspired. I'm trying to be encouraging, Miss Hart. I'm not looking for encouragement. Sloane's eyes met hers, sharp and unyielding. I'm looking for honesty. If it's bad, tell me it's bad. If it's salvageable, tell me how to fix it. I can't get better if you're going to lie to me out of politeness. Elena studied her for a long moment. There was something underneath the sharpness, something that looked a lot like fear. The fear of a student who knew she was capable of more but wasn't sure if she still had the ability to access it. Fine, she said. It's competent, but the thesis is underwhelming. You're arguing that Caravaggio's use of light functions as a moral commentary, but you're not actually demonstrating how. What about the calling of St. Matthew? The light in that painting isn't just dramatic, it's directional. It comes from outside the frame, from an unseen source. What is Caravaggio saying with that choice? Sloane's expression shifted, the fear giving way to something rawer. He's saying that grace comes from somewhere unexpected. That you can't control where it comes from, you can only be ready to receive it when it arrives. Interesting. Why didn't you put that in the paper? Because I didn't think I was allowed to make that argument. You're allowed to make any argument you can support with evidence. Even if it's personal? Elena paused. What do you mean by personal? Sloane looked away, her jaw tightening. Nothing. Forget I said anything. Miss Hart. I'll revise the paper. I'll have it ready by Wednesday. She gathered her things and stood up, leaving the coffee behind. Sloane. Sloane stopped at the door, her back still to Elena. Yes, Professor? Come back tomorrow. Same time. I'll have some sources for you that might help with the revision. Sloane turned, her expression unreadable. I thought sessions were twice a week. I changed my mind. I need to see the revision before Wednesday, and that gives me time to review it properly. It was a thin excuse, and they both knew it. Elena wanted to see her again. She wanted to understand why this particular student, this infuriating, manipulative, vulnerable student, had gotten under her skin in a way that none of her others had in years. Sloane's expression flickered, just slightly. Then she nodded. Tomorrow. 6 p.m. The second session was different. Sloane arrived with another carafe of coffee and a notebook, actually written notes, not just typed ones, and she'd done the reading. All of it. Elena had given her a stack of articles on Renaissance iconography, and Sloane had not only read them, she'd annotated them, highlighted key points, and written down 3 distinct questions about each one. Elena was frankly impressed. You actually did the work, she said, flipping through the notebook. Sloane's cheeks flushed slightly. You said you wanted commitment. I said I wanted you to show up. I didn't expect you to actually read the bibliography. Then you don't know me very well, Professor. Elena set the notebook down and studied Sloane's face. There was something different about her tonight, something softer around the edges. Her hair was down instead of in its usual perfect waves, and she was wearing a sweater instead of a blazer, something gray and soft that made her look younger, less armored. You look different, Elena observed. Sloane's flush deepened. I had a long day. I didn't bother with the usual. She gestured vaguely at her face. You know. The production. The production? I don't normally show up looking like I just rolled out of bed. You don't. You look. Elena stopped, realizing what she'd been about to say. You look beautiful. You look like someone I want to know better. You look like the person I might have been, if everything had gone differently. I look? Sloane prompted, a hint of challenge in her voice. Tired, Elena said, recovering. You look tired. Have you been sleeping? Sloane's expression shuddered. I sleep fine. The circles under your eyes say otherwise. Not everyone has the luxury of a regular sleep schedule, Professor. It was a deflection, and they both knew it. But Elena had been teaching long enough to know when to push and when to pull back. Fine, she said. Show me your revision. They worked for 2 hours, but it didn't feel like work. Sloane was engaged, asking questions that Elena hadn't expected, pushing back against interpretations that didn't make sense to her, offering readings that were genuinely insightful. By the end of the session, Elena had almost forgotten that this was supposed to be a transactional arrangement. Your argument is much stronger, she said, closing the laptop. You've incorporated the sources well, and you're actually arguing something original. And the grade? I can't promise a grade, Miss Hart. That depends on your final submission. At least tell me I'm not going to fail. Elena hesitated. You won't fail. You're too good to fail. Sloane's expression shifted, something vulnerable flickering across her face. What if I don't want to just pass? What if I want to be good again? Is that what you think? That you used to be good and now you aren't? I know I used to be good. I was top of my class. I was supposed to graduate with honors, do a PhD, become a professor, make my mother proud. She laughed, a hollow sound that didn't reach her eyes. Instead, I'm here. Begging for help from a professor who thinks I'm just another spoiled rich girl who can't handle reality. I don't think that. You called me a manipulative schemer. I said you were strategic. There's a difference. Sloane's breath caught. You called me manipulative. Elena sighed. Miss Hart, I'm trying to tell you that I don't think you're a bad person. I think you're a person who's been through something difficult and is trying to find a way back to who you were. That's not manipulation. That's survival. The words hung between them, heavier than intended. You really think I can do this? Sloane asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You think I can still be the person I was before everything fell apart? Elena met her eyes. I think you can be even better. But only if you let go of the idea that you have to be perfect to be worthy. Sloane stared at her, something raw and unguarded in her expression. Then she did something that surprised both of them. She reached across the desk and took Elena's hand. Thank you, she said. For not giving up on me. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. Sloane's hand was warm, her fingers slightly calloused from drawing and writing, and the touch sent a jolt through Elena that she hadn't felt in years. Miss Hart, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The non-fraternization clause? Is ridiculous, Sloane said. It's not enforceable. I looked it up. You can't just make a student sign a contract that restricts their personal life. It's against university policy. And yet you signed it. I signed it because I wanted to make sure we both had protection. You from your reputation, me from me. She pulled her hand back, her composure sliding back into place. I'm not trying to seduce you, Professor. I'm just grateful. There's a difference. Elena wasn't sure there was. But she let it go because she wasn't ready to examine what that moment had meant. By the third week, the cracks started showing. Not in Sloane's academic work, that was actually improving, her latest paper earning an A- that had made her smile in a way that stole Elena's breath for a moment too long. The cracks were showing in their careful distance, in the way they started finding reasons to stay after the sessions ended, in the way Elena found herself thinking about Sloane when she was alone in her apartment at night. Then came the evening everything changed. Elena had just stepped out of the shower in her office's private bathroom. She'd been working late, and the building was mostly empty. She was wearing nothing but a towel, hair still dripping, heading toward the main office to grab her bag and go home. Sloane was right there. She'd come back to drop off a book she'd borrowed, and she was standing by Elena's desk, phone in hand, and she looked up at the exact wrong second. Their eyes caught and held. Sloane's gaze dropped, just for a fraction of a heartbeat, down the line of Elena's body. The towel. The bare shoulders. The water still tracing a slow path along the curve of her collarbone. Then her eyes dragged back up so fast it almost looked painful, like she was physically wrenching herself away from a ledge. Neither of them moved. The office was narrow at that point, barely 3 feet of space between them. Close enough for Elena to see the hard clench of Sloane's jaw. Close enough to hear the way her breathing shortened, like she was counting each inhale to keep herself in line. Elena should have turned around. Should have gone back into the bathroom, closed the door, and let this dissolve into another thing they never talked about. She didn't. Instead, she took one step forward. Sloane took one step back, her shoulders hitting the wall behind her. And for the first time since the morning Elena had woken up with a contract she didn't remember signing, Sloane Hart, the controlled, composed, manipulative schemer, had absolutely nowhere left to go. The power flipped. Elena felt it. It happened like a current reversing direction, and something inside her that had been caged since the day she'd signed that contract came fully and dangerously awake. She leaned in, not touching, just close. Close enough to feel Sloane's breath stutter against her skin. close enough to watch the pulse hammering in the hollow of her throat. "Are you afraid of me?" Elena asked, her voice low. Sloane's voice came back wrecked, barely holding together. "Terrified." Elena searched her face, the locked jaw, the green eyes battling not to fall again, the hands pressed flat against the wall behind her, like she couldn't trust what they'd do if she let them move. This was the most controlled student Elena had ever met, the one who'd engineered an entire arrangement just to get close to her. And right now she was pinned against the wall, unraveling because of a professor in a towel who had nothing left to lose. Elena smiled, slow and deliberate. "Good." She turned around, walked back into the bathroom, closed the door behind her, and leaned against it. Her legs were trembling, her heart throwing itself against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her throat. She pressed her hand over her mouth and didn't know if she wanted to laugh or scream or march back out there and finish what she'd started. Because she'd just discovered something that frightened her more than the contract. More than the risk to her career. More than everything she'd spent years building. She liked it. She liked the way Sloane looked at her. She liked the electricity that crackled between them when the power shifted. She liked the dangerous heat that pulled tighter every time they were too close. She wanted more of it. On the other side of the wall, Sloane hadn't moved. Still pressed against the hallway wall, eyes closed, hands flat against the surface behind her, breathing like she'd just run for her life. She whispered into the empty hallway, to no one. "I'm in trouble." They didn't talk about it. The next session, they both pretended nothing had happened. Sloane showed up on time with coffee and notes, and Elena maintained her professional distance, and they discussed Baroque painting like their careers didn't depend on pretending the night before hadn't happened. But something had shifted. Elena found herself noticing things she had no right to notice. The way Sloane's perfume lingered in the office after she left. The way she bit her lip when she was concentrating. The way her eyes lit up when she finally understood a concept that had been eluding her. She started staying later, finding excuses to extend the sessions. Sloane didn't object. She just showed up, worked hard, and smiled that devastating smile that made Elena's chest ache in ways she'd stopped letting herself feel. And then came the night that broke everything. They were alone in Elena's office, long after the building had emptied. The session had ended an hour ago, but neither of them had moved to leave. Elena had been grading papers while Sloane worked on her research, and somewhere in the comfortable silence, something had shifted. Elena looked up to find Sloane watching her. "Professor," Sloane said, her voice soft. "Can I ask you something?" "You just did." Sloane rolled her eyes. "Something else." Elena set down her pen. "Go ahead. Have you ever wanted something you knew you shouldn't have?" The question hung between them, charged with meaning. "Everyone has," Elena said carefully. "That's what wanting is. It's not supposed to be convenient. But have you ever actually gone after it? Even when you knew it was a terrible idea?" Elena thought about the divorce. She thought about the years she'd spent pushing people away, building walls so high that even she couldn't see over them. She thought about the way Sloane made her feel like maybe those walls didn't have to be so tall. "Yes," she said. "Once." "What happened?" "I got hurt." Sloane's expression flickered. "Was it worth it?" Elena met her eyes. "I don't know yet." Something passed between them, something electric and terrifying. Sloane stood up from the desk, walked around it, and stood in front of Elena's chair. "Professor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The non-fraternization clause doesn't mean anything. I know you know that." "I know. But the university does have rules about." I'm not asking you to do anything illegal. I'm just asking you to tell me you feel it too. Elena's heart was pounding so hard she could barely think. Feel what? This. Sloane gestured between them. Whatever this is. The way I can't stop thinking about you. The way you look at me like I'm the only person in the room. The way I fall asleep at night wondering if you're thinking about me too. Sloane. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me I'm imagining it. And I'll walk out that door and never mention it again. Elena stared at her. Sloane's eyes were bright with something that looked like hope, and fear, and a desperate longing that mirrored what Elena felt every time she saw her. You're not imagining it, she said quietly. But we can't do this. You're my student. My career depends on maintaining boundaries. My reputation. I don't care about your reputation. I care about you. You don't even know me. I know more about you than you think. Sloane knelt down in front of her chair, her face inches from Elena's. I know you stay late because you don't want to go home to an empty apartment. I know you haven't dated anyone since your divorce because you're afraid of getting hurt again. I know you push people away because you think you don't deserve to be loved. Sloane. Stop. Stop pretending you don't want this. Stop pretending you don't want me. Elena reached up and touched Sloane's face, her fingers trembling against the warmth of her cheek. I want you, she admitted. I've wanted you since the day you walked into my office with that ridiculous contract. I want you so much I can't think straight. Sloane's eyes widened. Then why are you fighting it? Because I'm scared. Of what? Of what happens when this ends. When you graduate and realize I'm just a professor, and you have your whole life ahead of you. When you decide I'm not worth the risk. You're wrong. Sloane's voice was fierce. You're wrong about everything. This isn't a fling for me. This isn't about getting a good grade. This is about you, Elena. Just you. Elena's breath caught. You called me Elena. Because that's who you are to me. Not Professor Vasquez. Not your reputation. Just Elena. And then Sloane kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, like she was testing the waters. But when Elena kissed her back, when Elena pulled her closer, one hand tangling in her hair, the other gripping her arm like she might disappear, the kiss deepened into something desperate and consuming. Elena had kissed a lot of people in her life, but none of them had ever made her feel like this. Like she was standing on a precipice and the only thing keeping her from falling was Sloane's arms around her. Like she'd been waiting her whole life for this exact moment and hadn't even realized it until now. They broke apart, both breathing hard. Okay, Elena said, her voice shaking. Okay. Okay, what? We figure this out. We don't tell anyone. We keep the sessions professional. But this, she gestured between them. This stays between us. Sloane's smile was radiant. You mean it? I mean I'm terrified and I have no idea what I'm doing and this is absolutely the worst decision I've ever made. But you're making it anyway. Elena sighed. Yes. I'm making it anyway. For a few weeks, everything was perfect. They kept up the pretense in public, professional distance, polite greetings, nothing that would raise suspicion. But in the privacy of Elena's office, late at night when the building was empty, they were something else entirely. They talked for hours, not just about art history but about everything. Sloane told her about the breakdown, the hospital stay, the crushing weight of her mother's expectations. Elena told her about the divorce, the loneliness, the walls she'd built around her heart that Sloane was slowly, methodically dismantling. They kissed in the dark corners of the office. They held hands under the desk during sessions. They fell asleep together on the leather couch, tangled up in each other, and woke up just before dawn to untangle themselves before anyone could find them. It was forbidden and terrifying, and the most alive Elena had felt in years. But then the cracks started showing. Sloane's grades were improving. Her latest paper had earned an A, and she'd actually smiled when Elena handed it back, a real smile, not the guarded one she usually wore. But her mother had started calling more often, demanding to know why she wasn't applying to graduate programs yet, why she wasn't more aggressive about her applications, why she was wasting time on silly art projects instead of building her CV. And Elena was starting to realize that this thing between them, this beautiful, dangerous thing, couldn't last forever. "Have you thought about what happens after the semester ends?" Elena asked one night, lying on the couch with Sloane's head on her chest. "Of course I have. Are you going to apply to those programs?" Sloane was quiet for a moment. "I don't know if I want to anymore." "What do you mean?" "I mean..." She sat up, looking down at Elena with a complicated expression. "I started this whole thing because I wanted to prove I could still be the person I was supposed to be. The perfect student. The dutiful daughter. The one who made her mother proud. But now I'm not sure I want to be that person anymore." "Then who do you want to be?" Sloane's eyes met hers. "Someone who's brave enough to choose what she actually wants. Not what she's supposed to want." Elena's heart ached. "Sloane. I'm not saying I'm going to do anything crazy. I'm just saying I don't know if I want to spend the rest of my life doing something that makes me miserable just because it looks good on paper." She reached out and took Elena's hand. "What about you? Have you thought about what happens after this?" "I try not to." "Why?" "Because I don't know how to imagine a future that includes you. You're going to graduate and move on to bigger things. I'm going to stay here, teaching art history to students who don't appreciate it, and every time I see someone who looks like you, I'm going to wonder what might have been." That's a terrible way to think about it. It's realistic. It's cynical. Sloane leaned forward, her face close to Elena's. "What if I didn't move on? What if I stayed? What if we figured out a way to make this work? Because it's impossible. Nothing's impossible if you're willing to fight for it." "Sloane." Elena pulled back, her expression turning serious. "I'm not going to let you throw away your future for me. You're 22. You have your whole life ahead of you. You deserve someone who can give you everything you want without having to hide. I don't want someone who can give me everything. I want you. You don't know what you want." Sloane's expression flickered, hurt, then anger, then something that looked almost like resignation. "You're right. I don't know what I want. But I know I want you. And I know I'm willing to fight for you. Are you willing to fight for me?" Elena was silent. "Right," Sloane said, her voice flat. "That's what I thought." She stood up and gathered her things. "Sloane, wait. I'll see you at our next session, Professor." She walked out without looking back. They didn't talk about the fight. The next session was painfully professional. Sloane showed up on time, worked hard, asked good questions, and left without a single personal word. Elena watched her go and felt something inside her chest crack open. She was losing her. She could feel it happening, and she didn't know how to stop it. But she wasn't ready to let go. So she called Sloane that night. Not for an academic reason. Just because she needed to hear her voice. "Sloane," she said when Sloane answered. "I'm sorry." There was a long silence. "For what?" "For everything. For being scared. For pushing you away. For pretending I didn't want this when I want it more than I've ever wanted anything. Elena. I know I'm too old for you. I know this is complicated. I know there are 1,000 reasons why this won't work. But I don't care. I don't care about any of it. Because you're the only person who's ever made me feel like I'm not broken. Another silence. Then, softly, you're not broken. Neither are you. I'm a mess. So am I. And you still want me? More than anything. Sloane's breath hitched. Then why are we still pretending? Why are we still hiding? Because I'm terrified of what happens when people find out. Let them find out. Sloane. I'm serious. I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of pretending you're just my professor. I want to be able to hold your hand in public without worrying about who's watching. I want to be able to tell people I love you without it ruining your career. Elena's heart stopped. You love me? I thought that was obvious. Sloane, I don't know what to say. Say you love me too. Say this isn't just a fling for you. Say you're willing to fight for what we have. Elena closed her eyes. The words were there, waiting. She'd been holding them back for weeks, afraid to say them, afraid of what they meant. But she couldn't hold them back anymore. I love you, she whispered. I've loved you since the day you walked into my office with that ridiculous contract. I just didn't know how to admit it. There was a muffled sound on the other end of the line. Crying. Sloane was crying. I'm coming over, Sloane said. I'll be here. They made a decision that night. No more hiding. No more pretending. They'd tell the university, face the consequences together, and figure out a way to make it work. But first, they had to survive the semester. The weeks that followed were the most stressful of both their lives. Sloane's grades improved, Elena's teaching didn't suffer, and the secret relationship continued in the shadows of late-night office meetings and stolen moments. But the pressure was building, and something had to give. It came in the form of a letter. Sloane's mother had hired a private investigator. She'd been suspicious of Sloane's sudden academic improvement, her late nights, her evasive answers about her personal life. And she'd found out about the relationship. Elena, Sloane said, walking into her office with a pale face. We have a problem. What kind of problem? My mother knows. She held up a letter. She sent this to the dean. It's everything. The contract. Our relationship. She's accusing you of coercing me into a sexual relationship in exchange for academic favors. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. She can't prove that. The contract doesn't prove coercion, but it doesn't look great. And the fact that we've been meeting privately. Sloane. Elena stood up and walked around the desk. Breathe. We're going to figure this out. How? I don't know yet. But I know we're not going to let her win. Elena took Sloane's hands. We made a choice. We knew there would be consequences. Now we have to face them together. Sloane's expression shifted, fear giving way to something that looked like determination. Together? Together. The university launched an investigation. They were separated for 2 weeks while the administration reviewed the allegations. Elena was put on administrative leave. Sloane was forbidden from contacting her. They were both questioned separately, their private lives scrutinized by people who didn't care about them, only about protecting the university's reputation. But through it all, they stayed strong. On the day of the hearing, Elena walked into the room to find Sloane already there. They weren't allowed to speak to each other, but Sloane's eyes met hers across the room, and she smiled, a small, defiant smile that said, "I'm not giving up on us." The hearing was brutal. Sloane's mother testified, painting Elena as a predator who'd taken advantage of her vulnerable daughter. The investigation was presented to the board, the contract, the private meetings, the relationship. Everything. But Sloane was a better witness than anyone expected. "This wasn't coercion," she said, her voice steady. "I went to Professor Vasquez because I needed help. She didn't take advantage of me, she gave me a chance to prove myself." The relationship that developed was mutual. It was consensual. "And I would make the same choice again, every single time." The board deliberated for 3 days. And when they emerged, they delivered their verdict. Elena Vasquez was cleared of all allegations of coercion, but she was required to resign her position at the university. The relationship with a student, while not criminal, was a violation of university policy. She had to go. Sloane, on the other hand, was given a choice. She could transfer to another program, or she could continue at the university with a new advisor and a strict no-contact order. She chose to transfer. The day Elena packed up her office, she found a letter on her desk. It was Sloane's handwriting, and it said simply, "*I chose you. I will always choose you, *. Meet me at the coffee shop on Elman 7th, at sunset. Come find me." Elena read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, placed it in her pocket, and finished packing. She showed up at the coffee shop at sunset. Sloane was there, waiting. They stood across from each other on the sidewalk, the late summer sun painting the world gold and amber. "I'm no longer your professor," Elena said. "Does that mean you're also no longer my lover?" Elena took a step forward. "I'll always be yours. If you want me." Sloane closed the distance between them, her hand reaching up to touch Elena's face. "I'll always want you," she whispered. "That's the point. That's the whole point." And they kissed for the first time in public, where anyone could see. There were letters after that. Not official contracts, not legal documents, not academic agreements. Love letters, written by hand. Sent across cities, states, countries. They kept writing. Years passed. Sloane graduated from a different program, found her footing in the academic world, became the professor she'd always wanted to be. Elena rebuilt her career, found a position at a university that didn't care about her past, and published the book she'd been writing for years. They visited each other when they could. They talked on the phone late at night. They built a life, slowly and carefully, from the pieces of the one they'd had to leave behind. And when they finally moved in together, years after the scandal, after the investigations, after everything that had tried to tear them apart, Sloane found Elena sitting on the couch with a piece of paper in her hand. "What's that?" she asked. Elena handed it to her. It was a contract. "I, Elena Vasquez, hereby agree to spend the rest of my life loving Sloane Hart, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for as long as we both shall live. I, Sloane Hart, hereby agree to do the same. Terms of this agreement: unconditional love, mutual respect, and a promise to never stop fighting for each other, no matter what." Sloane laughed, tears streaming down her face. "You're ridiculous. I learned from the best." Elena smiled. "Sign it. You don't even need it anymore." "I don't need it. I want it." She pulled Sloane onto her lap. "I want everything with you. I want the contract, the commitment, the forever. I want to stop being afraid of what comes next and just be with you." Is that too much to ask? Sloane kissed her. Not even close. She signed the contract. And they lived the rest of their lives together, not hiding, not pretending, not afraid. They lived. If you made it this far, if you're sitting there right now with your heart in your throat, wondering if Elena and Sloane made the right choice, if love really can survive everything they put it through, remember this. Love isn't the absence of fear. It's the choice to keep going anyway. It's the choice Elena made, standing in that open elevator of her life, and walking back into Sloane's arms. It's the choice Sloane made, choosing Elena over everything her mother expected, over every door that was supposed to open for her. It's the choice you get to make every single day. Be brave. Choose love. And never stop fighting for what matters most.